Moody. I'm the director of the Social Justice Program at IFI, and a senior fellow, and I'm very pleased that we are able to present this report today and share our views and findings and hear your views and comments. This is a study that has been done jointly by Oxfam and the Assam Faris Institute at AUB to look at poverty, inequality, and social protection in Lebanon. It's a huge issue, and we basically divided up the work where Oxfam did the field research and the analysis of actual family-level poverty and how families fall into poverty and how they get out of it and how they cope with it, using field research, which they will tell us about. And our job was to do an analysis based on desk research as well as many interviews with people, looking at the policies, and policies plural, because there's many of them, to reduce or deal with poverty, alleviate poverty in Lebanon. We looked at existing programs, and we analyzed the whole question of, well, how do you assess poverty and how do you decide how to reduce it. So looking at the policy side, which is what IFI does, we're a policy institute. So this was a great example of how we feel that we can make the best contribution by, first of all, engaging with colleagues from around the world who are credible, serious researchers committed to these issues. And the consequent question of analyzing the data that we have and discussing it widely with the public, academic colleagues, the government, international agencies, because we feel this is really our best role, to be a link between research and policy making and all that space in between that does analysis and advocacy and other things. So we ended up with this study, which is available, by the way, already now on our website at the Assam Faris Institute and at the Oxfam website. You can download it from either website. And there is this shorter policy brief that we produced, which gives you a kind of quick summary of the main findings. This is available online, and there's a few copies here as well, in Arabic and English. So just one more comment I want to make. We feel that the power, really, and the relevance of the kind of work that we do at IFI in general, and in the social justice program, and I would say among research and AUB in general, really is not so much to give answers, but to ask questions. That really we find that in this case in particular, as you'll see from the discussion, there's a lot of issues about poverty, about measuring poverty, about alleviating poverty, that remain to be addressed so that we can, together, the government, the academia, the private sector, so that everybody can play their role to really address these issues. I was, frankly, personally heartened by the amount of work that's going on by the government and by international agencies, by civil society. There's an awful lot of work going on in this field, but there are still a lot of gaps, and we feel that the most useful thing that we can do is acknowledge the progress that's been made, identify the gaps that are still there, and together try to figure out, well, how do we keep moving forward and close those gaps and make sure that all people in poverty are actually identified and assisted in a sustainable and realistic manner. So with that, I will introduce the speakers today. We're going to have Sarah Al-Jaman and Rachel Eccles, who are Sarah's from IFI and Rachel's from Oxfam here, based in Lebanon. And they will together make a presentation about all the field work and analysis and findings that we came up with. And then Dania Sharaf, to my left here, she is the focal point and representative with all the international agencies for the Emergency National Poverty Targeting Program, and has been working intimately with that program for some years. Sadi Hanafi, Professor Hanafi, a sociology professor at AUB, is our principal discussant, and we will also get some comments from Dr. Fawaz Trabulsi, who is our faculty advisor for this project. at IFI. And we're going to open it up for discussion and comments for everybody who's here. So thank you for being here, and I will turn it over now to Rachel and Sarah to start us off.
Thank you, Rami. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I will start by summarizing the context and the rationale behind the study. First, it is important to assess poverty and coping strategies in Lebanon for both refugees and the host population in the wake of the Syria crisis and the subsequent refugee influx, which is likely to have put a strain on the infrastructure and the social services in Lebanon and increased job competition. It is noteworthy that Lebanon has the highest refugee-host population ratio of 27 to 100. The refugee influx has attracted a massive aid response by international agencies, and the aid has focused dominantly on refugees, which is causing tensions with the Lebanese host communities. Having said that, it is very problematic to distinguish the living conditions between poor Lebanese and the different refugee groups, which means targeting refugees alone is practically impossible and detrimental to social cohesion. And the aid response has also resulted in people putting pressure on the Lebanese government to tackle Lebanese poverty, which has been a reality since before the Syria crisis, in order to strengthen its poverty reduction mechanisms and also to better collaborate with UN-led projects and plans that target or include Lebanese communities. And also, poverty assessment using various methods is important in order to inform social program design and policy making. It's important to have social policies and programs that are evidence-based. So I will list our research questions. First, how is poverty measured by key stakeholders in Lebanon? What formal and informal policies and programs address poverty and inequality in Lebanon, and how are they accessed? How do the poor survive? What opportunities exist for program and policy reform in order to alleviate poverty? And the first two questions were tackled using literature review and informant interviews, and I will talk about them. And the last two were tackled using field work, and Rachel will talk about them afterwards. So just to explain the methodology, the research followed a mixed method approach for information collection and involved key informant and stakeholder interviews, as well as household interviews and focus group discussions with Lebanese, Syrian, and Palestinian refugees to better understand how the poor survive, and we used a modified household economy approach. A review of secondary literature was also conducted regarding definitions of poverty and how it is measured. Our presentation today will only focus on Lebanese poverty. So we conducted 33 interviews and focus group discussions with 128 households in 5 locations: Beirut, Tripoli, Afar, Bekaa, and Nabatia. And we used the snowball method, which means that households were referred from community-based organizations. An additional 17 traders were interviewed to gain a more multidimensional perspective on labor issues and how the debt system works. So the research is qualitative. It's not representative of Lebanon. However, it provides an insight into the lives and struggles of the poor and opens the door for further research. We also had a roundtable discussion to validate the findings. So how is poverty measured in Lebanon? First, I'd like to say that there is no international consensus or guidelines for measuring poverty. The most relied upon study that the government and many UN agencies in Lebanon use for their reference and their program design is this UNDP study published in 2008, which calculates the poverty rate using income-based indicators. So what does it mean to use an income-based indicator? Basically, it means that the kind of poverty that was assessed was income poverty, which indicates that a person is poor only if his or her income is below the country's poverty line. And the poverty line is usually defined using a specified amount of food that is necessary to meet minimum needs. So the question is, does income really tell the whole story? Usually income poverty is a quick way to assess poverty for international comparison, but it might not be the best choice for program design. Here I'd like to introduce another way of assessing poverty, namely multidimensional poverty. This goes beyond the income perspective to include the need for basic social services, including education, housing, health, and other utilities necessary to prevent individuals from falling into poverty. So And here I'd like to refer to one study that goes beyond just income to include more factors such as health, housing, education, and the general economic status. It was led by Adib Name for the ESPA in 2010. It was focused only on triple E. So after discussing the ways to assess poverty, the next step would be to discuss the various ways to lift people out of poverty. And this is what social protection is for. So to quickly define social protection, it's a set of actions carried out privately or by the state to protect people against risks and alleviate poverty. So what do we have in Lebanon in terms of social protection? We have the National Social Security Fund, which is a contributory fund that gathers contributions of employers, employees, and the government, and in turn provides three benefits: the end of service indemnity, health and maternity insurance, and the family and education allowances. The contribution to the fund is 23.5% of the wage, with 21.5% borne by the employer and 2% by the employee. More than 40% of employees are not registered with the NSSF. The NSSF, needless to say, it does not cover informal labor, self-employed, or the unemployed. It does not have any redistribution mechanism. It is ill-managed and prone to political manipulation. It also lacks strong enforcement mechanisms to ensure that employers do not hire workers without registering them with the NSSF. Also, several articles in the NSSF are discriminatory towards women, offering them less remuneration despite paying the same amount of money into the fund as their male counterparts. For example, Article 14 of the NSSF guarantees insurance cover for a non-employed wife of a husband who contributes. However, a wife contributing can only provide insurance cover for her husband who is over 60 or 80. We also have programs by the Ministry of Social Affairs, namely the Emergency National Poverty Program, which Ms. Dania will elaborate more on. So it combines social assistance and social service provision to extremely poor Lebanese households in the form of partial medical payments, school fee waivers, free books, and for the poorest of the poor, food assistance. The main challenge of this program is that only people who hear about it can then go ahead and apply. It is also lacking a proper impact assessment. It's relying on outdated poverty data from 2004 until there's a new recalculation this year, very recently. It tackles only income poverty as measured by the UNDP study. Also by the Ministry of Social Affairs, we have social development centers, which are local institutions designed to implement the Ministry's social development policies. They are permanent government institutions at the grassroots level and provide a range of services from medical support to vocational training. However, most of them have limited resources and limited capacity to meet the demand for these services. People who live far away from SDCs, especially in rural areas, have trouble finding out about them and accessing them. Other social protection mechanisms include the Ministry of Education and Higher Education provides enrollment fee waivers and scholarship in order to encourage poor households to keep their children in school. The Ministry of Public Health provides health insurance to about 1.6 million beneficiaries, most of whom are not covered by the NSSF or private insurance. The problem with these services, though, is that they are not institutionalized and are given on a case-by-case basis. We have a minimum wage of $450, but again, it's not enforced. We also have a bread price subsidy. So to give a general evaluation of the social protection system we have in Lebanon, we can say that it is characterized by dualism. So there is state-provided protection for those who work in the formal sector, but no comprehensive protection for those who work in the informal sector or the unemployed, except for a few limited interventions. We have high dependence on non-state actors. The weak role of the state has compelled international organizations, civil society, and political parties to intervene heavily. Social assistance is dominant, with limited social insurance and labor market programs. There is a multiplicity of underdeveloped programs and services rather than an integrated system. And the programs have many challenges regarding access, outreach, capacity, sustainability, and impact assessment. It is biased in favor of the better off who have better access to information information and are employed. There is gender discrimination, and lastly, labor laws are not enforced. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rachel, who will present the fieldwork findings.
Hi, thank you, Sarah. So I'm going to talk about the findings of the field research and then some recommendations that came out of this study. And just to mention again that, the field research was done based on interviews with 128 households. It was done in both rural and urban areas, with a bit more bias towards urban areas. And we also interviewed Syrian refugees and Palestinian refugees because we wanted to get different perspectives of poverty and to understand better about how different groups access different types of support. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're just focusing on Lebanese. So we found through our interviews that Lebanese households made between $4,000 and $8,000 per year. And to put this in perspective, the poverty line that was established in 2007 put the lower poverty line at $2.40 per person per day. So per year, so for a household of 5, that comes out to about $4,380 per year. So that's the lower poverty line. Then the upper poverty line was $7,300. So this kind of puts that sort of firmly within those parameters. 50% of the households spend about 50% of their expenditures on food. Almost all households bought their food from markets, which kind of makes them very vulnerable to market fluctuations. The rest of the money that they expended was pretty much evenly distributed between debt and housing, education, and health. Also, there was households found it more difficult to pay for expenses during the winter than during the summer. Households also almost exclusively worked in the informal sector, mainly in the agriculture, construction, and service sectors. They generally had no fixed contracts and had irregular cash flows, and their household expenditures were dominated by food expenditures. So. Then also female-headed households were the poorest of the poor. I mean, they were the sole breadwinners and also had to balance their care duties at home at the same time, and had to rely a lot on sort of charity and support from the community. So among the households we spoke to, a lot of common challenges came out. So first, as part of the methodology of speaking to households, we use this household economic approach, and part of that is to compare the current year to sort of the last sort of normal year in the country. So we looked at 2010, so households sort of compared where they were now to how they were in 2010. And when you make that comparison, households were still poor in 2010. So, and they felt like they were pretty much on the same level. So there was no sort of major drop since then. So what they sort of spoke about was that they had this ongoing economic stress where they just could never find either work or enough work, steady work. So they're always sort of hovering like around the poverty line, so to speak. And they were also said that the major issues that kept them in poverty were household shocks. So someone in the household got sick, someone died, someone lost their job. This is sort of what, amongst the stress, sort of put them on more of a downward spiral. And then women talked about having a lot less education attainment. Most had not passed primary school, dropped out sometime during secondary school. They had struggles with mobility. They felt like they didn't have enough work experience to get a job, and a lot of the jobs that they accessed were in the informal sector. It would be sort of ad hoc, like cleaning houses, sort of doing sewing, doing sort of like small things that they could sort of get their hands on to bring in more money. And they also struggled trying to bring in income at the same time, being the main carer and having their domestic roles. They also talked about how they felt that their expenses well, basically their incomes had remained the same since 2010. However, they felt that the commodity prices had gone up, so they were able to stretch the amount of money that they could make less. And they also talked about job competition. It's just more difficult to get jobs, and then if they could, it was more difficult to get sort of enough hours, enough days of work, and to get like any kind of permanent contracts. So out of all this, how do the poor survive? Like, how do they do it? How do they manage? So the number one way that they manage is through debt and borrowing. So this sort of works in two ways. They take out money at sort of different shops in order to buy, food and different household items. So they basically have multiple lines of credit at different stores, and they generally could take out like a maximum of about $50,000 per month. And so they would sort of manipulate different shops in order to get enough to sort of survive and pay back just enough in order to sort of keep it going. When a household would experience a shock, then they would have to borrow larger sums of money. And then this sort of ends up forming a very significant part of their expenses, to where they are constantly having to pay back debt in order to sort of try to get back to zero, in order to cope. And then if they get a second shock, that then just further amplifies the amount of debt that they take out. Then informal support was another major way that people survived. So there were anonymous donors within the community that would help people, especially female-headed households, so that they depended on that a lot. There's also sort of charities within the community, civil society, and then there's also religious and political charities that help households. Another way that they cope is to defer health care. So they would self-diagnose, they would self-medicate. People said that they would just, if they were sick, they would just take Panadol and sort of wait it out. And they wouldn't go to the doctor until it was like a real emergency. And then finally, some households talked about either taking their children out of private school and putting them in public school, or just taking their children out of school altogether. So I wanted to give you an example of one of the households we talked to. So this is a case study of a 7-member household based in Nabatea. They have one breadwinner, so the father. He makes about $8,000. So in 2010, he made about $8,400 per year. He drove a pickup truck, and in 2010, the pickup truck got in an accident, and he was injured, and he wasn't able to pay for the repairs, and he was out of work for a few months. Eventually, so the household sort of dipped down, as you can see, in terms of the poverty level. They're kind of hovering right above the upper and the lower poverty lines. So, so he was doing construction, and then he had a work-related injury on the site, so he couldn't work anymore. So he took out a loan from his father for $1,000. He got his truck fixed, and he pulled his son out of school, and he had his son drive the truck and do his job, or the job he formerly did. Then his wife had some problems with her kidney, and then his daughter had some medical problems as well. So they were hospitalized. So he had to, so his father wrote off that $1,000 debt. They still had to take out loans because the business wasn't going very well with his son, and then his son eventually got sick. His household has a lot of bad luck, I think. They started just having to take out loan after loan after loan. And then by the time they got to present day, which was last year, 2015, they were over $2,000 into debt. So sort of telling you the story, not to depress you, but to just to show you, well, two things really. One is that if you sort of measure household poverty based on expenditures only, then it sort of masks that people are largely propped up on large amounts of debt. Debt that they can never, that they might not be on track to ever pay back. And as you can see, if you take into account this household's debt, so that lower dotted line, I mean, they're pretty much going below the poverty line, despite the fact that it seems like they haven't changed that much from 2010. And then just also to show you that it's these shocks that seem to be putting households under into this downward spiral of poverty. And if this household has another shock, which seeing how things go is quite likely, they're just less and less able to recover. So, what can be done to help people? So, the study came out with some recommendations to the government, to civil society, and to donors. And this is sort of a brief summary of what the recommendations are. But the first recommendation to the government is to build a social protection system in line with the social protection floor. Now, the social protection floor is a sort of internationally recognized concept. I'm going to read the definition. So it's a nationally defined set of basic social security guarantees that should ensure over the life cycle that all those in need have access to healthcare, education, and basic income security. So basically, it's a nationally set standards that try to catch households if they dip below a certain threshold, sort of bring them back up to make sure that everyone has a minimum standard of living. So that's sort of the concept of the social protection floor. So it's to base the social protection system on this concept of the social protection floor. So to do this, the recommendations are to sort of consolidate all the existing social protection policies and programs to make sure that all the different sort of ministries and all the different moving parts that exist right now are more well coordinated and are just consolidated to provide like a comprehensive package. To strengthen existing programs and outreach, right now there's SDC centers all over the country, which Dania will talk about, that do an excellent job. But some households that live in like more rural areas don't necessarily have access because transport costs. Some of the programs differ at each SDC, so there's no sort of standardization. So to help like strengthen what already exists. And so that also goes to my next point about just empowering SDCs with adequate resources and capacities to have like the best programs possible for people. And then design new policies to meet the specific needs of marginalized groups. So specifically taking into account households female-headed households that have people with disability, child-headed households with different needs. And the second one is just to update poverty data. So the last, I think, major poverty study was done in 2007. So to update the poverty data and also to use a more comprehensive methodology to assess poverty. So not only looking at money metric poverty, but also taking into account living conditions and sort of more multidimensional poverty factors. And then stricter enforcement of labor laws, such as enforcing the minimum wage and enforcing places to do the NSSF contributions. For civil society, recommendations include creating awareness on the importance of a comprehensive social protection strategy and action plan. Work together to propose a social protection floor that considers the specific challenges that households, that households face. So again, looking at female-headed households that are particularly disadvantaged, but also the shocks that households tend to experience, like a death of the breadwinner, like these health shocks that sort of came up over and over again in our interviews. To work with MOSA to strengthen delivery, information management, and M&E systems and outreach, so just to try to help support and bolster them. And then to look at opportunities to strengthen resilience building activities. Some SDCs already have livelihood programs where they do vocational training and business skills development. So just to help bolster the number of programs that exist and the quality of the programs. Finally, recommendations for donors. So to support the strengthening of the existing social protection efforts and design of new policies and programs. So this can be done by initiating dialogue between the government to create a strong policies based on the social protection floor, and also to support the strengthening of the existing systems. So adequate resources need to be provided to the government to help them to strengthen the existing social protection system, and just to influence the government to implement and enforce existing labor laws. So those are the recommendations in summary, and thank you for listening. These are the links to the reports. So the report and the brief, which is also available here, can be found at this website, and then there's also the Oxfam website, or you can just Google. Thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Dania Turaf from MOSA, MPTP is going to talk about the existing social protection system. Do you want to sit here?
Hello, my name is Tanya Sharaf. I'm going to present about the Emergency National Poverty Targeting Program. For those who doesn't know about the project, I'm going to give a historical look about it. Next to the July 2016 or 2006 war, the Lebanese government signed for several financial and economic reforms at separate international world conferences, including those made during the Paris Free Donor Conference in 2007, where the government of Lebanon has received a grant from the World Bank, the Canadian government, and the Italian government to finance the emergency social protection implementation support project. Under the social sector component, a national social safety net system emerged. Thus, the National Poverty Targeting Program, MPTP, was implemented based on a pilot phase done in 2008 and 2009 in 4 SDCs in Beirut, and it was implemented later based on a national public campaign through TV, radio, billboards to spread out the program. Let's talk now about the implementation phase. MPTP was launched nationally on November 17, 2011, and 96 SDCs first, and becomes later 114 SDCs in all over Lebanon. It is managed by Ministry of Social Affairs and Presidency of the Council of Ministers. Its main objective is delivery of social assistance and services to improve the living standard of the population, especially the extreme vulnerable, and its future objective is graduation of targeted population from the poverty dilemma. What is the method used to test or to select the Lebanese vulnerable? It was the proxy means testing that was used to select the Lebanese household considered extreme poor. It is ranking the household based on a fairly easy to observe set of measurable characteristics reported by the household and observed by one of the social workers. For example, the health, level of education, quality of dwelling, ownership of durable goods, occupation of adult members, etc. The households are ranked from the extreme poor to the least vulnerable based on a total with a cut-off score. And of course, it was based, the cut-off score, on the old national poverty line. Let's talk now about the application process. It is divided into 2 phases. The first phase is the household register at one of the STCs related to his residency and give their consent for more further collection of information. And the second phase, the social worker visits the household to collect additional information, socioeconomic ones, and the data are scanned in the database centrally using scanning technology of optical marking recognition in the questionnaire form and logged for changes. Later on, further processing is done centrally, including information verification, cross-checks, as well as the assignment of calculating the proxy score, which is finalized and officially concluded by the PCM. As I mentioned, the presidency of the Council of Ministers. Later on, the household is informed and giving a card including his name, the score, the validity of the card, allowing him to benefit from the services delivered. What are the EMPTP basket of benefits? First of all, health coverage, including hospitalization, primary health care services through the Ministry of Public Health, medication for chronic diseases if available in the SPCs. And the second phase, in the basket, we have registration or fee waivers for students in the intermediate and secondary public schools and plus the vocational schools for the expenses which are not covered by the Ministry of Education. The e-food voucher assistance with the operation of World Food Program, but only for the poorest of the beneficiaries, around 5,076 households. And lately, we are operating with UNICEF to transfer cash assistance to 75,000 Lebanese children between the age of 0 and 15 years old as winter cash assistance for only one child. Let's see the statistics till our date. The total number of eligible beneficiaries of EMPTP are around 105,849 households, and as individual are around 463,312 individuals. Those who are getting the food assistance are only 5,076 households. And as of April 2016, around 36,606 beneficiary patients were covered by MPTP, and 91,732 beneficiary students are also covered by MPTP as of April 2016. Let's look at these two maps here to show the percentage of applicants by Muhafaza on a national level. If you can see the difference between the applicants in the north were 9.58% who applied to the program and 6.49% were selected as beneficiaries. The total number of applicants in all over Lebanon out of the total population is 21.71%. And 13.24% were selected as eligible beneficiaries. We cannot ignore when talking to poverty the impact of the Syrian crisis on the rate of poverty in Lebanon, especially in the last 4 or 5 years. Geographically, and after the influx of Syrian refugees, majority of the displaced Syrians are located in regions already having high poverty rates, deepening the vulnerability rate as competition for jobs, services, and consumable resources increase. 86% of the displaced Syrians and 65% of the poor Lebanese are living in the same 215 cadasters, based on a study done by UNICEF in 2013. So in order to rapidly respond to the needs of the government and help alleviating the impact of the Syrian crisis on poverty rate, it was necessary to do scaling up of MPTP, which will be again supported by the World Bank through the Social Promotion Protection Plan. But unfortunately, it needs the approval of the cabinet, and due to the absence of the president and the political situation in Lebanon, it will be delayed. So, to support MPTP, it was necessary to coordinate with the NGOs. And based on the LCRP, Basic Assistance Sector Framework, only 14% of the all winter activities that goes to the Syrian refugees and the Palestinian returnees from Syria and the Lebanese returnees, only 14% goes to the Lebanese vulnerable through MPTP. So the main objective of this activities was to meet basic needs and mitigate the tension between refugees and host communities. So MOSA, via MPTP, is coordinating with NGOs, international non-governmental organizations, and UN agencies to ensure a smooth implementation of such activities. But the selection of beneficiaries is done only through MPTP, based on, for example, criteria predefined, such as lower scores, altitudes, etc. Of course, considering MPTP through the LCRP as the only a source of information regarding Lebanese poor families. What are our future objectives? We have the short-term plan, which is somehow going on now. The short-term plan is to expand the coverage, enhance EMPTP social assistance package, to introduce new benefits to the basket like food assistance and primary health care services, technical assistance to EMPTP administration, readjust the 8% of extreme poor with a questionnaire which is finalized now with new indicators to readjust the 8%. With a new national poverty line, $4.8 per capita per person, based on the last World Bank mission and Central of Administration of Statistics survey. The long-term plan is to merge the proposal of one of the deputy, Mr. Robert Father, Af'al, with MPTP, and to reform it to a governmental institution. This needs the acceptance of the government and the approval of the deputies. Through this proposal, the graduation will be through training, building capacities, and education. And I want to thank Rachel for the recommendations for donors, because our major challenges is now funding shortages. This is at the end the poverty distribution per government rate based on the database of MPTP. As you can see, the concentration of poor is in the north area, mainly in Mini, Akkar, and Tripoli in the first phase. And 20% of the total population are located in Bekaa, of poor Lebanese, 19% in Mount Lebanon, 15% in the south in Nabati, and only 1% in Beirut.
Thank you, Sari. You want to make a comment?
Yeah, yes. Thank you for the presenter. I enjoy reading the report, the summary, and well, I think sociologically speaking, the survey and the fieldwork done properly, and I found very interesting findings, technical findings that the survey showed. And I would like also to congratulate you to take in the same time Lebanese and Palestinians and Syrians in the same week, because I will tell you this is the first time the three are who live in the same country is taken into account in one survey. The national sport in Lebanon is to feel that you don't see Ain al-Hilwa, for instance, when you study Saida, even if you will study sewage system, so you don't know where is this extraterrestrial people throw their water, etc. So, and you don't have the same survey where you can compare social structure of poverty, living conditions of people living in the same area. Just to tell you the importance of having one survey. For instance, in France last year, it was the first survey showing extremely clearly a societal discrimination in employment against French from Arab origin. And this is only possible because you systematically study the population, and then you can neutralize different aspects of social capitals, of geographical location, of sectorial, etc. You look to the same people graduated from the same schools, the same universities, and then you do differential analysis to know whether there is a discrimination or not. Here in Lebanon, you cannot do this. Either you have pro-Palestinian scream, say, we have problem on poverty for Palestinians. Myself, Judge Shaban, we participate in many surveys for UNRWA just to talk about the Palestinian, other for Syrians, and UNDP, they did many times, and the ISQA for Lebanese only. So this is really something I should highlight to congratulate you in this regard. About this congratulation, but I mean, I think what frustrates me is, again, this is another report in poverty alleviation strategies that I feel, okay, maybe for a ministry it's important to see where is more niches now of poverty, but again, it's very interesting. We have only one study done by Lebanese alone. I mean, this is I don't know what her name about Gini coefficient. I mean, the remaining is UNI, and I'm sure somehow the international community through UN or international organization like Oxfam come say we need to do this. So when we will one day have a study driven locally to study not only geographical analysis or mapping poverty, but to delve into sectarian and social class analysis. And here really I'm so glad Fawaz with us because I think his last book الطبقات الاجتماعية والسلطة السياسية في لبنان it's a must reading to understand how poverty is generated in Lebanon. And just let me also make advertisement that in next issue of إضافات Arab Journal of Sociology, we will have two review of this book, two opposing views of Fawaz, just to show that how complex these issues, and really it's time that we delve into this. Sarah Al-Jamal and myself, we did a study about 220 articles written in the Arab world about poverty and social inequality. And and of course, one of the major results is that majority of articles is about poverty mapping and poverty alleviation strategies. To tackle, if you like, the determinants, the causes, to highlight rural versus urban poverty, etc. Were very lacking. And just funny enough that most of this study is conducted by World Bank or scholars funded by World Bank. Okay, so somehow some would say World Bank policy generate poverty and World Bank policy generate poverty alleviation strategies. Before delve in this, I would say there is two missing, two things is missing. Is the first that Adib Nama study 2015, and I'm surprised because Sarah and we went together to the opening, to the launch of the report. You didn't mention it at all.
I did. There was a slide dedicated to it.
In the presentation, I was mentioned as a...
Where is it? Yeah.
This one.
This is sorry. It was not in the report, but no, it was not in the report, but in the presentation. Okay. So because I relied on.
You're right. It's not in the report.
Yeah, not in the report. Because it's a very interesting where we have if you like, a case of urban poverties, and we see the complexity of this. The other point, I was surprised that you confuse the legal definition of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and the sociological one. When you say you have 500, almost 500,000 of Palestinians, this is a legal definition. I agree that you have Palestinians in Lebanon who still have this status, in spite of the fact that they are in the Gulf since, let's say, the 70s. But sociologically, the number is not correct at all. You have maximum 280,000 Palestinians from Lebanon, and you have 20 Palestinians from Syria, here in Lebanon. 20,000. I interviewed the guy of UNHCR, of UNRWA 2 days ago, who reported to me this number. So the number is much less than you mentioned. I think what also frustrates me a little bit in the report that is you didn't highlight sufficiently the extreme situation of the Palestinians of Syria, because I will tell you what happens after 5 years. UNHCR is repatriate many Syrians from Lebanon to outside. Of course, the Palestinian of Syria here in Lebanon is not allowed to be repatriated. There is a war criminal, a Lebanese war criminal who ordered them. I will not mention who is. Why I said Lebanese war criminal, because this should go to the court. Why we prohibited people in a high, not in double, in a triple hardship situations. They cannot renew their visa here, their residency. They cannot work. Why we prohibited UNHCR to repatriate some of them? You have only 2 families repatriated. The 2 is gay family. So it's the only way. I mean, again, it's so telling about the imaginary.
Sorry, we're not understanding. What's this?
No. UNHCR repatriate to the third country some of the Syrian refugees to Canada, to Europe, to etc. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Lebanon prohibited UNHCR to repatriate any Palestinians. Okay, it's very interesting that in Jordan UNHCR repatriate some of the Palestinians from Syria. If tomorrow I will write an article say they should be equally treated according to the hardship, their hardship situation, some of the political commissar will come and say, right of return, where is right of return, etc. I mean, this question is not raised in Jordan. So we should imagine how some political trends using again and disregard the extreme cases of Palestinian of Syria in Lebanon. I will finish by saying that again. We were very happy when we saw Thomas Piketty highlight the major inequality social inequality in the world, because his survey is in the world about the return of patrimonial capitalism. It means that the wealth, the privilege, the properties are under-taxed, while your work, your productive work, is overtaxed. However, Piketty looked only to unequal inclusion inside of the society. More and more, not only in countries like Lebanon, but I would say worldwide, you have people completely excluded from labor market, completely excluded from the basic, for their basic need, and this is we need to look how come the percentage of those who are excluded is increased so much. And here I will invite you all to go back to Karl Polanyi work. The great work, his book is called The Great Transformation. He has a theory of fictitious commodities, and the commodities are labor, money, and property. How labor become, I mean, we scream, we say we don't want to commodify labor, but it's not commodified, it's fictitiously commodified, because more and more labor it's in informal sector and not informal sector. Money, you know about all the financial crisis, and the money, how you can make a huge amount of money transfer without any basis. So it's also money become fictitious commodity. The property, the speculation in Lebanon is exemplary. I mean, somebody who wanted to understand what is fictitious commodity, go and study Lebanon. And I would say finally, and we are at American University of Beirut, to say more and more our knowledge become a fictitious commodities, in the sense that is more and more households should pay for education and higher education. And maybe this is some ideas I give to Rami, Sarah, to Oxfam. This is a kind of study should be done really if we are interested to understand the poverty. And I will not tell you to understand the poverty, you should maybe make a study, next study about the rich. This was what he may say after me. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you have there a pretty good set of presentations and comments that show the complexities, the sensitivities, and the brutal importance of this issue. We've been trying to address this question initially by doing this poverty work and social protection work with Oxfam, and it's a very limited study basically designed to point out some key issues. It's not a comprehensive national representative sample, but it does highlight the real stresses and the real dangers and the real opportunities to figure out what's missing, where are the inequities, where are the weaknesses in even just deciding what creates poverty, and how do you reach people. The government clearly admits they don't reach everybody. They can't reach everybody for various reasons. So there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done, especially when the consequences of long-term poverty and social marginalization and deprivation translate clearly into political and in some cases to security problems. When desperate people do desperate things, this is very clear. We've seen this over the last 20, 25 years all over the Middle East, and it's probably getting worse, not better. In the last 5 years, certainly, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Lebanon, Palestine, many countries are regressing still in terms of equality and in terms of the large numbers of not just poor people, but desperate people. And how desperate people react is something that is very concerning. So we are thinking of studying in the next phase wealth and poverty together, and the policies that allow wealth to such big amounts of wealth and such rising amounts of poverty. How do those things happen? what's the policy framework? What's the national context? What's the international context with all these global agreements and trade agreements? And what's the role of donors? What's the role of bilateral assistance? There's so many dimensions to these issues, and we're just grappling now with what can we do that's useful to address these issues. And our job is to do research. We're not activists, we're not NGOs, we're not government policy advisors. Our job is to do honest research that recognizes the tough issues, deals with them honestly, and tries to come up with sound knowledge that then helps policymakers, donors, international agencies, private sector. The role of the private sector is almost totally unstudied, I think, in this whole situation. I mean, if soft drink manufacturers can reach every household in the country at a profit, well, why can't we reach every household in the country with reasonably priced bread? I mean, so there's some fundamental issues that we can discuss with the private sector, and I think there's a lot of scope for serious research here. So I'd like to ask just for Wes to make his quick comments and on any aspect of this that he'd like to talk about. Professor Wes Bulsi is our faculty advisor, and then we'll open it up.
Thank you, Rami. I can't thank the team because I'm part of them, so thanks, Sari, for the reference to the book, but also, more importantly, a reference to the fact that this is a study that isolates the poor from the rest of society. I mean, the assumption, which we're questioning, but which dominates what's being done, is exactly the World Bank conception that there is a problem called poverty, and poverty does not need to be understood. We don't ask the question, why are the poor poor? We take it for granted that they're poor, and the idea is the two slogans of the World Bank: protecting the poor and creating good jobs for the rest. This is the world we're living under, has those two measures for our economic and social life. So to start with, what we've listened to is a study which takes for granted or does not deal with the fact that the question of poverty needs to be understood. That's one. The other, I should point out to the fact there is a lot of confusion about poverty of the Lebanese and poverty of those who are on Lebanese territory. The mention is Syrians and Palestinians. I should say this presupposes that we're not studying why they're poor. If you're studying why they're poor, the mechanisms that make Lebanese poor are not the same as those that make the Palestinians poor and the Syrians poor. At least you can say that the Syrians and the Palestinians are doubly poor. There is the fact that they are unevenly rewarded on Lebanese territory, and the reason they're here is that they've been displaced from their country. Now, let's be clear about it. There is a lot of gala in this. The idea is to get more financial aid to the Lebanese government on the assumption that the presence of Syrian refugees or displaced, which I prefer to use the term, is weighing upon the poor Lebanese. I have not heard, I have not seen, I have not read any proof apart from general ideas, including the fact that they live in the same regions. The fact that they live in the same regions, to my mind, is not serious statistics, nor sociology, nor economy. So we don't know what is the impact, despite the fact that I fully support the fact that the international community should help the Lebanese government and other organizations to the maximum to deal with this question, but they're not the same. They're the same if you mess around with why there are Lebanese poor and why there are Palestinian and Syrian poor. That should be clarified. Another small point, we always talk that Beirut is just 1% in the poverty. We forget that the suburbs of Beirut form part of Mount Lebanon. So Beirut is a city with many poor, with a high level of poverty, except for the fact that the suburbs of Beirut, the hot suburbs of Beirut, have traditionally, like in most other countries, been separated administratively from Beirut and actually linked to the most, to the least poor region of the country. Now, the third thing to talk about is there is a huge confusion in the criteria. I still emphasize, actually, it's very clear. How do we judge poverty? By consumption of dollars per day, by income. The World Bank and studies are always confusing the two. And we shift from one to the other, but it's very interesting that in both cases, as has been presented, most of the characteristics of poverty are not there. For example, we do a study of poverty, but we don't know what percentage of the poor are unemployed. We know, at least the study Rachel presented, that the high percentage of the poor are employed, and that the poor, despite the fact that they work, which should raise the question, of course, not of individual cases, why somebody has an accident in the family, but what are the inequalities at work in the Lebanese society? So poverty is absolutely, as Sarah has pointed out, divorced from the question of social inequalities and what creates. Now, another idea is that we bump on, and which is very interesting, which is the basic philosophy of the World Bank is that poverty is geographic. The idea that poverty is 75% geographic and 25% hierarchical, let's see. This is why a lot of the work is being done on Lebanese regions, but not much on Lebanese suburbs. And that's quite a weak point in all our work. We don't know the suburbs of Beirut, and the suburbs of Beirut start from Yujdeidi and end up in Sahra Shwefet. You're talking about a huge belt, whereas we call the suburb, the southern suburb, and we're forgetting that all those are suburbs, including Tariq Jdidi. That's very interesting because what the study of Adib Na'mi reveals is very funny. Since if poverty is geographic, how do we understand the poverty of a city? The city all itself is geographic, so you have to use other means of judging what is poverty in a city. So a lot of confusion about between income and consumption, and I should emphasize that there's a lot of logic about consumption because the economic unit that the World Bank recognizes is the market. So just to conclude, this is a study which does not touch upon why the poor are poor, what relationship, and which accepts that the poor are a case in themselves, effectively outside the rest of the Lebanese society, and what is needed to deal with them has practically nothing to do with what government policies should be. Taxations are not real. There is a problem of half of the Lebanese are not covered by the national security. Nobody says, why don't we have national security for everybody? Because those who are not allowed to be under the national security are those who mostly the poorest and the unemployed. No relationship of poverty alleviation to government policies. This is why, to conclude, the Lebanese state is given the same role as the NGOs. The Lebanese state in this program is a state that distributes charity. And this is the term of the World Bank, charity. It's called protection, but millions of questions. For how many years is this program going on? We don't know. Does this program alleviate poverty or maintain the poor as they are? And last but not least, if the state is to play the role of the civil society, why in the hell is there NGOs and civil society? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to add one more comment, and then we'll open it up. It's really striking to look at the modern Arab world. And we're talking about poverty here and social protection, but if you look at any other area, women's employment, youth unemployment, overall unemployment rates, if you look at most of the countries in the Arab world, in the last 30 to 40 years, most of these statistics have not changed very significantly. There is some chronic problem in the economies and the political policies, probably, of these countries. So when you get youth unemployment that's like 30% in Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and other places, and even Saudi Arabia and places, and it's been that 30% for the last 30 years, I think that raises questions beyond just measurement issues and other issues. There's a structural common problem across most of the modern Arab world in these critical areas. Another one is learning outcomes. Why have public schools actually deteriorated in the last 30 or 40 years? Informal labor mechanisms. Informality is probably growing. Maybe it's around 40% on average around the Arab world, informal labor. It goes up to 60 in some places, 25 in others. So these are really deeply entrenched problems and stresses. And I think all of us, universities, NGOs, local NGOs, international NGOs, World Bank, donors, governments, all of us have really not seriously come to grips with the driving causes of these chronic disparities that ultimately are more than just reports and statistics. We're talking here, there's 25 million primary and secondary school kids in the Arab world who are not in school. 25 million who are not in school. And they're probably never going to go to school because of wars and refugees and other things. When you have 25 million 7, 8, 12-year-old kids out of school, in conditions of no employment, what's going to happen to these people? We're talking about large numbers of people. We're talking about 45% on average of secondary and primary school kids tested in Arab schools who can barely read and write and do literacy. They're functionally illiterate, and they're in school. And it's about almost half of the kids are like that. So these problems are really enormous, and we need to figure out, all of us together, the different things that we do, what is the best thing that we can do to, first of all, understand these problems, understand their causes, and then advocate for the people who make policies, local people as well as foreign people, to actually make better policies. Because this trend has brought us catastrophes all across the Arab world, and within countries, if you don't have civil wars and total collapse as you do in Libya and Yemen and Syria and other places, you have severe polarization and fragmentation, with about half of the people of the country essentially living day to day. So the scale and magnitude of these issues really, I think, needs to be better understood. And we feel that we're trying to play our role at IFI and AUB and the Social Justice Program and Oxfam and our colleagues, everybody's trying to see what is the most useful thing that they can do. So I just wanted to highlight, to put this in a wider context. And we'll open it up for comments, and then the speakers can all make their comments after we get around. We'll get around with questions. Let's start with you here, and then over there, two, and then over here. So we'll start with those four, and then we'll make your questions, if you could, short, so that we have time to get a lot. And identify yourself and point the closest microphone towards you and speak into it.
Okay.
There you go.
I'm Eugene Aklema. I am research associate here at FI, and I'm doing my PhD in Italy. Now, the question is really fast. There was a lot about poverty and not so much about inequality. So, as has been pointed out, it's about why poor are poor, and how to alleviate that, and not very much about why the society is unbalanced and how to balance it. And in this regard, my question is out of ignorance, is how does the fiscal system in Lebanon work? Like, is it progressive? Is it based on flat rates or progressive rates, is assessed on income or wealth, especially in Lebanon, where there is so much, the economy is so much about financial assets and real estate wealth, maybe much more better measured than income. The question is about fiscal policies and their distributive effect.
Okay, thank you.
My question about the report itself. I mean, it strikes me as, I don't know about the selection of the household or that technicality, but on the recommendation at the end, it seems to me it's a bit formulaic. You would have done that without any study. You would have seen that in any country. You can send it to Indonesia, to Jordan, to Tunisia, where there's the poverty, and you say you should strengthen your protection floor, you should enforce better, social security institutions and minimum wage. I mean, there's really nothing about how to tackle this in the context of the Lebanese challenge, with all the complexities. It really seems like a kind of, let me say it maybe harshly, a boring exercise in producing formulaic recommendations everywhere. With the danger of giving wrong, actually, and dangerous recommendations, because they're formulaic. For example, minimum wage. What does minimum wage imply in a country where you have lots of refugees from Syria who depend on lack of minimum wage? Because if you want to enforce minimum wage, you have to give everybody a minimum wage. Therefore, Syrian refugees will not find jobs. They work on the basis that they go below minimum wage. That's how they survive. So it seems to me there should be an attempt to look at something, first of all, related to the country, something different, something tackle the situation here. You can't assume also that the political actors are going to act in good faith. So you have to also recommend things in the absence of the good faith or in the presence of all the problems, so that you can recommend something which will not be thrown in the bin. And I've seen this before. So it's harsh bit, but and I agree also with Fawaz about the fact that counting Syrians and Lebanese is a bit risky because of the political accessibility of the Lebanese poor. If the Lebanese poor gets sick, accessibility to hospital through political patronage, clientelism is available to them. And I know this from my village. People, even the poor, will manage to, through the family links and through political clientelism, be able to access medical care. Not to the same level, to the same degree of others, but while the Syrians have problems, Palestinians is a different thing. So we have a problem, a huge problem of permanent refugees here, that we have to find jobs for them, and you cannot simply impose, easily talk about high minimum wage, and because high minimum wage will apply to nationals only, if it won't apply to Syrians, that will be a huge problem.
My name is Leila Kabalan. I'm the program coordinator and I was part of the research team, but I will just be moderating instead of John.
I'm from Hillsfield. I was struck by a comment you made about how the mother and the daughter who were hospitalized just had bad luck. And it's actually not bad luck at all. I mean, poverty is the strongest determinant of ill health, right? So in a sense, this leads me to think about the conceptual approach to the subject of poverty, because other than counting dollars and coming up with a figure, it seems that the multidimensional aspects that were partially incorporated in the escort study, but I'm not sure if they were not captured well. health, education, and all these aspects are core components of reproducing poverty. That's a primarily a product of broader social inequalities and systems of exclusion, but also their consequences. So there's a need to account for this complexity, which didn't come through in the presentation.
Thank you.
My name is Sasha. I'm from Yemen, and I've done a couple of studies on social protection for Yemen and Gulf countries mainly. This is very interesting, but I was wondering because in the Middle East region we have something like the zakat system. So in Yemen we have that counts as social protection. If it's in the law, the resources and revenues has to go to the social welfare fund. So I was wondering if this is happening here, because Lebanon is it has religious diversity. So are there other religious programs that fit into the social protection aspect? And the second thing is in terms of the labor law, the labor market and unemployment. I think maybe I'm not aware about what's existing in Lebanon, but also looking into the active labor market policies. So the training programs that connect the private sector, public sector with the people who are unemployed. And I'm not aware if it exists in Lebanon, but maybe if it does, it would be nice to reflect that in the study. That's it.
I don't know how to respond to the fiscal system.
Fiscal system? We have a fiscal system that works in the opposite direction. No, I'm serious. The indirect taxes are the bigger chunk of the revenue from taxes. Real estate speculation is not taxable. There is no inheritance tax. You pay inheritance dues, and the maximum percentage of income tax is used to be 10% under Mr. Hariri. Now it's 15%. Definitely no progressive tax, but statistically, the most taxed Lebanese are the Lebanese who have fixed salaries, because the companies, the enterprises, subtract the tax directly and send it to the ministry. But as for tax evasion, a very nice statistics that comes from HSBC Switzerland. There are 8,500 Lebanese who have accounts in HSBC Switzerland to the amount of $4.2 billion. Bear in mind that this is a country which has in itself a bank secrecy law that should tell you a lot about the faith of businessmen in their country. They don't even trust the Lebanese bank secrecy system, so they need to go to HSBC Switzerland, and that's only HSBC. Huh? There are a few dozens banks in Switzerland, as you know.
Why don't we focus on inequality, although it's in the title. So our presentation only tackles Lebanese poverty, but the report is much more than that. It's about also Palestine refugees and Syrian refugees and inequality. We didn't do any quantitative measurements of inequality like the Gini coefficient, but because our study was qualitative interviews. But we found two types of inequalities. The first one regarding legal status. mostly with the refugees. They had legal restrictions that hindered them from finding jobs. And the second one was gender discrimination, that females found it harder to be able to make income because they had restrictions regarding mobility and gender roles. They had to work, they had to take care of the household, at the same time work outside, and also female-headed households were in particularly worse off.
I can answer Rasha's question.
So we do have a lot of informal social protection coming from religious charities in form of, for example, zakat from Dar al-Fatwa and other Christian organizations. And I would like to stress that it's actually very important because we don't have a very good formal social protection mechanisms. The poor people actually rely heavily on informal mechanisms, including charities and civil society and borrowing from relatives and family. Regarding labor market interventions,
active labor market policies.
Yeah, I don't think the government has, I mean, Ghana can but I don't think they have interventions per se, but they do collaborate with the, for example, Lebanon Crisis Response Plan, which is UN-led, and they have labor market interventions. So, on a small scale.
Okay, I'll try to answer both your questions, or comments anyway. I guess about the sort of what your comments about the study, I agree that it's nothing groundbreaking. I hope you don't throw it in garbage. And I think part of the value is that we could work with AUB and work with MOSA on this together. But I guess the idea was that there's not a lot of poverty data about Lebanese, and we, as far as Oxfam, we work in different locations with Palestinian refugees and with Syrian refugees, but there's a lot of Lebanese poor in that we just don't have a very good understanding about. So we wanted to do sort of a small-scale study, just more in-depth interviews, just to get a better understanding, not to sort of measure them in terms of poverty, but just to ask them questions about what are your challenges and what is your life like, just to get a better understanding of what it means to be poor in Lebanon. So it's a small study, and that's sort of the only objectives that we had for it. But I agree that much more could be and should be done to understand poverty in Lebanon. And if you, I didn't mean in any way to imply that the mother and the daughter just had bad luck. It was a more off the cuff statement that the household in general, because they had so many shocks in such a short period of time. But I fully agree with you that when you're poor, you're more vulnerable, and you're more vulnerable to all of these things, whether it's health or any kind of shock. So I completely agree with you on that. As far as sort of not capturing the multidimensional aspects of poverty, I also agree that the study didn't do that. Again, we were more asking open-ended questions to households for them to give us information about what their challenges were and sort of how they were surviving, instead of sort of, we didn't know what dimensions to ask yet because we haven't really seen any dimensions established. Meaning that we just wanted households to have the chance to sort of express themselves on what it means to be poor. So it was just very open in that regard.
I just want to comment on what Dr. Jalisi mentioned concerning the vulnerability approach for the Lebanese. He mentioned that this is based on geographical distribution of the Lebanese, which is not very accurate because the testing mechanism we do at MPTP is full of indicators, full of variables, testing the assets of the house, the consumption of the family, the level of education, the employment rate. We have a database, very, very rich database that can test the household and select them based on these indicators with a cut-off score, and now we are proceeding in the new phase with a new, more modified questionnaire to reflect more the actual situation after the Syrian crisis, to select only the extreme 80% of the Lebanese and to have them the basic levels.
Yeah,
With the-
but can
with the new national
I
poverty
say
line.
something? For instance, I observe poverty in the south because we have relatives in the south of Lebanon. What is very interesting, the lack of cooperatives. I mean, agriculture cooperative in Lebanon. This is a huge issue. I mean, the possibility of a non-poor household to become poor just within a few months. So this I think the issue is, instead of spending money for such funds, I mean, you should spend money creating cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives. This is, we know almost, it's the root causes of Akkar area and in the town area. So this is I mean, so again, you should delve more in your questionnaire to see how structurally, I mean, suddenly because of the closure of the market, of the border between Lebanon and other countries, I mean, make the prices is so low and nobody bear the consequences. So.
Well, we can get back to that, but we'll take a round. So.
Yes, I have two questions. While mentioning the recommendations, you mentioned that you want to enhance the social protection, but by enhancing the social protection, how you want to finance it? Through international aid? Is it sustainable? Or through our tax system, which is mixed with bank secrecy? And as we all know, corporate and SMEs through our bank secrecy are not paying their taxes. They declare to the government that they are losing money. And when they want to apply for loans, they have another company who is auditing their account. So many SMEs and corporate are not paying their taxes. There's only like people with fixed salaries who are paying tax. And about tax network justice, I mentioned like there's $1.9 billion yearly as tax evasion from Lebanon. This is half of our deficit. And how do you think this can play a role in equality in Lebanon? And the last question, since in the World Bank, you are dealing with the World Bank with international aid, you never mention the counterpart of the economic diplomacy between Lebanon and the World Bank, especially in Paris 3 agreement. There is always, through Washington consensus, we need to be more liberal. We need to be less tax. We need to be less state intervention, so we can stay dependent with the World Bank. Is it sustainable to move the state apart and be always dependent for the World Bank to reduce inequality and poverty in Lebanon? Thank you.
I'm from the School of Business here at the ABU, and I did similar study, also qualitative in the States, and lots of the themes that emerged here are similar to what we saw in the States also. But I was able there to see that people were differentiating between permanent versus temporary poverty. So I don't know to what extent that the people here spoke about, okay, we are in it, we fell into poverty, but we know we can get out of it, versus there's this determinism that probably we're stuck in poverty for a very long time, but we don't see any hope. So you came up with a set of recommendations, but any of these recommendations were brought up from the people whom you interviewed? Was it more like they are the subjects of the study versus they are participants in the study, so they can see ways out of their trouble? Let's put it that way. I know that it's very important by itself to see what it means to be in poverty, what it means for them to be in poverty, but were they able to articulate venues or opportunities for them to overcome the kind of challenges that they are facing.
Thank you. Any more questions? Start.
Sorry, concerning the World Bank dependency, you mentioned we as NPTP are funded only by the World Bank. World Bank funding only its operational cost of the program, not the services that is responsible, because all the services given to the Lebanese are funded by the government through a money allocated since the beginning of the program. E-food voucher is funded by the donors because it's for a minimum number of beneficiaries, 5,000 households.
If I can jump on the same question, isn't usually the operational cost the biggest cost? So how would that be kind of, let's say the World Bank money runs out?
Operational cost in administration.
Yeah, and aren't those usually
budgets for the offices? But not all the employees are paid by the World Bank. We have 700 social workers are paid by the government. Only the headquarters are paid by the government.
Well, I guess for the first question, I don't have much of an answer for the first question because we didn't do any sort of recommendation. We did recommend that donors help support the government. I know the World Bank is already trying to help with the social protection program here, and it shouldn't be a thing forever. So, I mean, ideally, UN and World Bank organizations work with the government to try to come up with a policy and come up with a plan for funding over the long term, while trying to have more initial funding, but I don't have any specifics on how exactly it would be funded, especially in light of tax evasion and things like that. And then for your question, so it's really interesting that you did a similar study. For your question about temporary versus permanent poverty, all the households we spoke to, they said that they were in poverty before 2010. So it was definitely felt by the households to be more of a permanent state, and that they felt like they were barely sort of treading water, and then they kept getting hit by these sort of shocks over and over again. So we didn't really get the feeling that people felt like there was much of a way out of it. This household economic approach methodology that we used is meant to work with people when we train the people who are interviewing on sort of making sure households felt completely heard and had a chance to voice all of their concerns. So it's supposed to be a more empowering approach. Whether or not we were completely successful in that, I'm not sure. But I do think that interviews about poverty should be gearing more towards more of a participative kind of approach rather than treating people as sort of subjects. So that we did attempt to do that. And then as far as seeing ways out of poverty, I mean, people were already doing as much as they could and utilizing as many resources as possible in order to pull themselves out of poverty. For households that were not yet on the MPTP or weren't working with SDCs, we did sort of refer them to these locations so that they could get more support. But yeah, there wasn't very much hope for things getting sort of better in the short and medium term.
Do you have any more questions or comments?